Good afternoon. We're going to start the afternoon session with a panel giving voice to victims' families and survivors. And I think this presentation is particularly important for people that are working in the field to have a better understanding about our personal experiences after the loss of our children. And I have an unusual connection both with Parkland and Newtown. The day of the Newtown shooting, I live in Connecticut, and I lived about 30 miles from Newtown. And on that horrible day, I was actually at a FEMA training in Bridgeport and how to work with children who are impacted by a trauma. And so most of the people participating in the conference or the workshop were actually from law enforcement. So the phones and cell phones started going off. And of course, most of the people in the training left to respond to the shooting in Newtown. And so I spent quite a bit of time in Newtown, both in the immediate aftermath at the Family Assistance Center, and then between Christmas and New Year's at their call center, and was trying to help those people that I was in touch with think about the response and how they could hopefully mitigate some of the challenges that we saw following 9/11. But what I realized then is that once the community mobilizes, and it goes back to some of the other presentations on the importance of pre-planning, some people, there was a reference to you don't want to look at a manual. Most communities don't have a manual. So once the community starts mobilizing, it's really challenging to make a helpful intervention. And then as far as the Parkland shooting, our first home after I was married was in Coral Springs, Florida. And at the time, this was in my early career, I'm a social worker now, but at the time I taught elementary school at Hunt Elementary in Coral Springs, Florida. And so I have still a lot of friends that worked in the school system there. And so these two events, and all of the events, but these in particular brought it home to me about how vulnerable our communities are. And you're no longer safe going to a mall, going to a church, going to a school, and so how can we as communities and as individuals be more prepared? So I want to welcome both Fred and JoAnn. Fred Guttenberg is the founder of Orange Ribbons for Jaime. He's the father of Jaime Guttenberg, who was killed in the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting in February 14th of 2018, so just about 6 months ago. He's also the brother of Dr. Michael Guttenberg, who was a 9/11 first responder and who lost his life this past October due to 9/11 related illnesses. So Fred comes to us with a wealth of information about what families go through after some of these losses. JoAnn Bacon is the founder and director of Charlotte Helen Bacon Foundation. She's a mother of Charlotte Bacon, who was killed in the Sandy Hook Elementary shooting on December 14th, 2012. And so I want to welcome them both, and after they present, I'll also share my personal story following the loss of our 24-year-old son, Brad. So Fred?
Thank you. Thank you. Sitting through this morning and learning all about PTSD and the responses, after the year my family has had, I can only say yes, we've seen it all, experienced it all, and I think even some things that you haven't identified yet. So I can tell you one change that's happened in me is I don't really care who I'm talking to anymore in terms of their status. And I will approach anyone to talk about my story. And my approach is always this: hi, my name is Fred Guttenberg, father of Jaime Guttenberg, who was murdered in Parkland. And up until this week, I've never had anybody reject that handshake. So for those of you who were paying attention to the news, that was me. With that, thank you. So with that, I want to talk about my truly unique and American story. Back on October 17th, I lost my brother Michael to the cancer that resulted from the 9/11 tragedy. I remember it as if it happened yesterday. The frantic calls between my family. Has anybody heard from Michael? Has anybody heard from Michael? So we know my brother. My brother was wired like your typical first responder. He knew only one thing. When there was an emergency or a tragedy, he was the first one running in. So we spent that entire morning worrying about Michael. At the time, he was doing his fellowship through the New York Fire Department. His office was pretty much across the street from the World Trade Center. He was in before the second building even got hit. He was in there with a team of about 10 physicians, and they were at a basement level area. I think, and some of you may know the connecting buildings better than I do, I think between 2 and 7 or something like that. And the physicians that were there were going to use a garage-sized room for supplies. They were waiting after the second building got hit to start taking care of patients. While waiting, at some point later, and we all know the story, they heard noise. And next thing, dust and debris. They realized what was happening. The building was falling on them. And they ran into this room, and they hid out. They pulled the garage door down. And amazingly, the room that they hid out in did not collapse. They could not go back out that garage door. It was blocked. But they found a way out on the other side. My brother and these first responders spent 16 days at Ground Zero treating patients. We did not know he was trapped or there. The last thing he did was think, oh, I got to pick up my cell phone and call my family. Because he wasn't wired that way. He was wired to deal with the emergency at hand. Around 1:30 that afternoon, my family and I started preparing ourselves for the worst. We assumed he was gone. Until a lady who went to where the triage eventually was set up started taking names and numbers of first responders. I wish I knew the name of this lady, but when she called my parents, she wouldn't tell them. She just wanted to tell my parents, I've spoken to your son, he's alive, he's well, he wants you to know that he's working, and to leave him alone, he'll call you when he can. And that was my brother. So following the events of that day, Michael went on to live a great life and have an amazing career. He was single, he didn't have kids. And his life really was great. He had tremendous success. And in the world of emergency service in New York, I would call my brother a giant. And some of you in this room may have known him. About 5.5 years ago, everything was going great until the pancreatic cancer diagnosis, which resulted from his exposure. Cancer was caught early, surgery, chemo, radiation, and my brother amazingly dodged another bullet. He was cancer-free, or so we thought. Back around mid-2016, his cancer came back in his lungs, and then in his stomach, and then in his liver. And his whole GI system started to shut down. I spent a good part of 2016 and 2017 until he passed, going back and forth to New York to help take care of him. I had sold my business in November of 2016, so I had flexibility. He was, like I said, single and did not have kids. And we, as a family, watched my brother go through the worst. What was crazy about my brother was his optimism and his heroism. I'll never forget, just a few months before he finally passed, having a conversation with him and trying to tell him, you know what, it's you, Michael. Everything is going to be fine. You're like a cat with 9 lives. Nobody survives the World Trade Center falling them and a pancreatic cancer diagnosis for as long as you have. And he goes, and don't forget, I've been shot at twice as well. You know, so my brother was a pretty unbelievable guy. Bottom line to us and everyone else who knew him, he was a hero. He lived his life to save others. It was all that he knew. He left behind my parents, myself, my 3 other siblings, 6 nephews, 2 nieces, plus an amazing network of friends and extended family. It was from his network of friends that we learned what a great leader, teacher, and mentor Michael was to so many, some of whom are in this room today. I know you worked at Northwell with my brother. We were truly touched at how many told us the reason they became first responders in the world of emergency service was because of my brother Michael. For me, what defined Michael was his role in 9/11. However, for Michael, he's always made it clear to us what made him most proud and what defined his adult life was his role in teaching and mentoring those who have a world in emergency service today. To all of the first responders in this room, if there are any, thank you. You are all heroes. Michael was my hero. He knew that, and he was a hero to so many others as well. I remember my brother's funeral like it was yesterday, being really depressed over his loss, but also amazed at the funeral that was given to him. He was buried with full honors from the New York Fire Department, helicopter flyover, big flag draped over the road. They even closed down the Southern State Parkway. And we had about 500 people. And I thought, wow, for my brother, you know, what a life he led. I also never expected to be a part of a funeral that was more tragic, bigger, or worse. Unfortunately, I was. While still mourning the loss of my brother, and with the support of my family and our friends, we were again struck by tragedy. But like I said, this time it was a lot worse. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, a day of love, it started at my house like any other day with chaos. My kids were running late, the dogs were barking, we're rushing the kids out the door. My wife and I need to get ready to leave the house. That's what I remember about that morning. What I can't remember about that morning, and which will haunt me for the rest of my life, is in that chaos, did I remember to tell my daughter, I love you, as she ran out the door. It will haunt me forever. It wasn't supposed to be the last time. My kids left for school that day like any other. Only one of them would come home. My daughter, Jaime, that day was murdered in school. Thankfully, my son, Jesse, who was also at the school, was not harmed that day. Jaime was the toughest person I knew. She fought for her life until the very last second, and we know because there's video of her. She was one of the kids unfortunately killed in the hallway, and there is video of her running down the hallway, running for her life with an active shooter at her back until boom! A single shot severed her spinal cord. Did my daughter die instantly? I don't know. Was she paralyzed and unable to tell anybody? I don't know. Did my daughter suffer? I don't know. I will wonder these things for the rest of my life. To this day, I don't know what she experienced. What I do know, it was the worst kind of fear possible that anybody ever could experience. And in a weird way, and I really was so intrigued by everything that was being discussed this morning, I've lost my capacity for fear, because I'll never, ever, ever feel what she felt. I think about her final seconds every day of my life. What happened to my daughter, and doing something about it is now my life's mission and purpose. I always used to tell my kids, and as long as we wake up in the morning and those we love and care about are safe and healthy, and we go to sleep at night and everyone is still safe and healthy, that we were having a good day. Everything else in between, it's just a bunch of stuff you got to manage and get through. Well, unfortunately, we've been having some bad days. Our home is very different. With Jaime in my house, you were always laughing or yelling, but you were always responding because of her. That was the vibe in my house. It's a really different vibe now. We miss her humor, craziness, energy, and feistiness. Our home is a lot quieter. Everyone says, give it time. It will get easier, right? It doesn't. Every day is a new reminder of loss. Holidays, Mother's Day, Father's Day, birthdays, dance recitals. My daughter should be learning her new dance routines for this year. I miss her more every passing day. I miss not having my brother around to help me when I need it the most. My only hope is that somewhere they are together and that my daughter is taking care of my brother, because I'm sure it's not the other way around. She was just that kind of kid. On February 15th, the day after the murder, I attended a vigil in Parkland. I was asked by the mayor if I wanted to speak, and I said yes. I did not prepare. I had a lot that I needed to say. It was the beginning of my public life. My life is now forever changed as my public role continues to evolve. I've dedicated the rest of my life for fighting for the cause of gun safety, and for those who think attacking me on social media is going to make me stop, nope. You haven't met me, you don't know me in words, they're just not going to stop me. So this is my new mission, and I intend to go forward with it. What I remember from that night of the vigil is the feeling that I described, of feeling broken. And what has helped me to heal is the greatness of people. The truth is, in both of these tragedies, I've seen the best of this country and its citizens, and I've also seen the worst. However, it's the best of this country that has dominated and has given me the strength that I need every day to go forward. It's obvious in ways big and small. I think back to my brother's employer, Northwell, and other health agencies that he had worked for, and how amazing they were to him. And to this day, I believe he lived longer because of it. I think back to the 2 funerals that were coordinated in large part by others, because honestly, we were too broken to do it on our own. In both cases, people who I never knew became part of my new network of friends as they reached out only to help, to comfort, to provide anything that our family needed. I'm thankful for the increased level of love and attention from those who my family always knew. What's amazing is how people just seem to know when we needed more support or when we needed more space. I've had the opportunity to meet new people in my role as an advocate for public safety, and I am thankful for every one of them. I cannot do what I'm doing today without them. If anyone in this room has been a part of my public support or was a part of the amazing group of citizens that simply reached out, thank you. It is the greatness of people that gives me the strength and the inspiration to go forward. I'm determined to lead an effort to change in our public safety, and we are succeeding in ways both big and small like never before. Change is being seen in the business world and in legislative victories. We've not seen another 9/11 event in this country because of the amazing efforts of many in this country to take steps to ensure that it never happens again. I'm hoping that we can lead a similar effort now for gun safety. These were 2 distinctly American tragedies. In one, America stood up and took action, and in the other, America must stand up and take action. No other family should go through what my family is going through now. As someone who has suffered through these 2 distinctly American tragedies this past year, I feel I have no choice but to do everything in my power to ensure that more is done to protect the families and citizens of this country from preventable tragedies going forward. We will change our American culture, and we will succeed in delivering safer streets with less gun violence, so that in the years to come, I do not have to meet someone from this audience at a future event where they are now the featured speaker talking about what happened to them. Enough is enough. To close, I simply want to say we do have levels of strength and resilience that we do not know about until we are tested. My prior worst moments do not compare to what has happened this year. Remember my story when you're going through what seems like a bad moment or the worst moment on the job, in business, or in life, and then think back to all the other moments before that where you felt the same way, and remember the moments past. Got through it. My advice is to remember, as long as those you love are safe and healthy, you're having a good day. All the other moments in between are moments that will come and that will go, but you will get through them with the support of those around you. To the many present and future heroes in this room, I will also say that those moments in life, when they do come, such as 9/11 or a school shooting, are your opportunities for greatness. It is in life's hardest moments that heroes and leaders are born. Thank you.
JoAnn, you're next. Yeah. Great job.
I might need a few tissues. It's okay. This is my family. It's my husband Joel, myself, my son Guy, my daughter Charlotte. Thank you. I haven't done a lot of public speaking, so please forgive the emotion. I'd like to thank you, Mary, for the invitation to share the story of my family, my daughter, and myself. Giving a voice to the families that have lost someone is one of the most important gifts that you can give them. It gives them the power when so much has been taken from them. Power to share their beloved, their ideas, opinions, and story. A story without edits, amendments, and revisions. This is my daughter, Charlotte. This picture was taken on the first day of school, first grade. She would die 4 months later. She was shot in the small bathroom of her first grade classroom on December 14, 2012 at Sandy Hook Elementary School. Charlotte was my only daughter and the youngest of my 2 children. She was rambunctious, smart, and always getting into mischief. She loved wearing dresses and her hair in pigtails. She called them piggies. She had the most amusing stories and was full of crazy antics and kept us laughing. Still to this day. Our home was noisy, full of laughter, and sometimes a little bit of fighting. And Charlotte brought an energy to our home that cannot be duplicated. I love everything about her and her place in our family. When Charlotte was a baby, I knew I had my hands full. Before even crawling, I could see that she was a force. As she grew, I watched and admired her determination and her innate understanding of who she was and what she needed. Her personality was bold, and I often caught myself thinking that I didn't need to worry about her, that nobody was going to mess with her. I imagined that raising a daughter was going to be difficult. I just never imagined that I would be robbed of that opportunity. But at 6 years old, she was no match for what happened at her school. She just never had a chance. These are some pictures of this, me and Charlotte. This one, where she's standing in front of me, was from our last family vacation in the summer of 2012. I've come to understand that Charlotte's death is a hurdle I will never clear, and I've learned to be okay with that. In these last 5 years, I cannot tell you how many times I've heard, "Don't let this define you." And I find this concept completely absurd. Charlotte's death most definitely defines who I am today. It is defining as the family I was born into and the community I was raised in. Her death has altered the course of my life and has challenged my view of the world, my community, and my place in it. But I've also found a way to integrate my loss and find purpose. But that journey's had many twists and turns. It's stalled out, and it's been rerouted. My purpose has evolved too. There are many unknowns in grief, even for those of us that are in the muck of it. But there's one constant, and that it's always changing. And where I am today is very different than where I was 5 years ago, but yet it's very much the same. To explain the aftermath of a high-profile mass murder is very complicated and involved, and I can only share my experiences and perspective. As I considered my message and audience, I felt it was important to share the things that would be helpful for you all to understand those complexities. I've had a lot of support and many loving people in my family. My family and I could never adequately express the impact that their love has had on our well-being. But today I believe it would be most helpful if I was to share some of the difficult truths. Some of you in the audience are here to learn how to support individuals and communities after a mass tragedy. It's my hope that my presentation will give you a glimpse of what it's been like for my family to grieve a personal loss in such a public way. Excuse me. From the beginning, most of my choices have been made to retain control and normalcy. One of our first battles was to control. Oh, thank you. One of our first battles was for control over Charlotte's story. My husband and I struggled for how our daughters had somehow become no longer our daughter. Her rights and our rights as parents of a minor vanished the moment she died. We found ourselves powerless when her name, picture, and story were used to promote different causes and agendas without our consent. To us, Charlotte was no longer Charlotte. She had become an object in the backdrop of mass murder, and that's never acceptable. Unable to control the misuse and the usurping of our daughter's story, we turned to what we could control. We could make sure that a true record of Charlotte's life was available, and so we wrote a children's book. Charlotte would be remembered as bold, beautiful, flawed, curious, and loved to the ends of the earth. The book concept began just 2 months after her death, but it would take almost 2 years to complete. It was released on what would have been her 9th birthday. We say it was a gift, our gift to her. She wouldn't be forgotten, but it was really a gift to myself, although I didn't know it at the time. Writing that book was the start of a long journey of diving deep into my grief. It required actively remembering when avoidance was what I really wanted to do. It required me to spend endless amounts of time trying to capture my daughter's spirit, passion, and motivation, as well as sharing funny Charlotte stories with our co-author. The book is so authentic to Charlotte, from the storyline to the illustrations that perfectly capture her unique style and her messy bedroom. One of the most difficult days came during the creative process. On this day, I was spending time in Charlotte's room, recreating outfits from her closet so I could take pictures to send to our illustrator, when I realized that some of the clothes I was looking for laid in a heap in her closet, still unwashed. And I was reminded that her death was not so different. She also laid in a heap in a small bathroom, not much bigger than the closet that I was rifling through. These types of realizations have the ability to bring me to my knees. The recovery can sometimes take days and weeks, sometimes even months. We've done nothing since her death that has been as beautiful or as painful. The book was all about Charlotte, but it was also the beginning of finding my voice. In the midst of my acute grief and trauma, the pressure to become part of an advocacy movement was immense. I felt as if all eyes were on Sandy Hook with expectations. This was not the avenue Joel and I were interested in pursuing. We watched the divisive rhetoric and knew we were not made for this type of battle. We needed and asked for privacy. But that didn't always stop advocacy groups from knocking on our front door with agendas and printouts in their hand. It had been less than 3 weeks since the shooting when our family, along with other Sandy Hook families, were told that we had about 6 months to enact change. After that, everyone will have moved on, we were told. This horrible advice came from an individual with a long list of highly respected credentials. And this should have never been said to a new group of bereaved families or parents. Like so many grieving parents, the need to do something in Charlotte's name was already simmering. So hearing that we had 6 months before people were gonna forget made it more urgent. Joel and I knew that we needed to find a way to honor Charlotte that was unique to her and the things that she loved. And we realized how one of those things had found a purpose in our life since her death. Our son had become attached to the therapy dogs that were visiting his school since the shooting. The one thing that Charlotte loved most, only second to her family, was a dog. Within 9 months of her death, we launched the Charlotte's Litter Therapy Dog Program, which advocates for the use of therapy dogs in K-12 schools. After the program launched, my interest and motivation in it waned. I struggled with self-doubt. I felt discouraged that the way that we chose to honor our daughter was considered somehow less profound or significant and did not live up to the expectations that had been placed upon us. These expectations usually came in the form of comparisons. When talking about how we were honoring Charlotte, we were often asked if we were doing anything with certain gun violence prevention groups or mental health. The implication was that walking the halls of Congress was important, and our work with therapy dogs was cute. I knew that Charlotte would be proud. Our son was proud. But we were made to feel that we were not doing enough. That the way we chose to honor our daughter was self-indulgent when there was much bigger problems to solve. One of the biggest supports, One of the biggest supports through these last few years have been many of the families whose children died with Charlotte. There were 26 families who lost someone that day, and each family has found a way to cope and grieve that's unique to them. And I was fortunate to find comfort with those who had a coping mechanism similar to my own. In many ways, these connections have been a lifeline. Particularly in the first couple years, the public nature of the shooting brought a whole host of dilemmas, and it was a really confusing time. And we were not the only ones impacted that day. There were children and teachers that heard and saw things. For the most part, there was a level of respect around those experiences. Most of the children were too young to speak, and most of the teachers understood that it'd be really difficult for the families to hear their own experiences. My immediate reaction was to set strict boundaries around the demands placed on my family, our privacy, and the flow of information. But unfortunately, those boundaries were not always respected, and when those boundaries were breached, my trust deteriorated, and I withdrew from those who failed me. And I did this without question. My daughter was dead. I was knee-deep in caring for my family. Friendships and connections were broken, and I did not have time to mourn those losses. Living in a grieving community presents a whole other realm. Even with all the professing of Newtown Strong and Sandy Hook pride, my community was fracturing. There were numerous reasons for this fracturing, but for me, the two most obvious was a lack of reverence and the influx of money. In my eyes, there appeared to be a need for the community to distance themselves from the shooting. It felt as if many wanted to erase the reminders and sanitize the brutal truth of our history. The answer to this reaction was to destroy the difficult reminders. The town purchased the murderer's home and razed it, and the school was a complete teardown and rebuild as opposed to a partial teardown of the area where the shooting occurred. As the school was rebuilt, everything needed to be changed and different. The floor plan, the exterior facade, even the approach of the drive. It was a new Sandy Hook school, a new era with a new history. The school was opened without fanfare, as requested by the lost families, but it also opened without remembering each of the 26 who died, those who paid for that school with their lives. It would take 6 months and numerous requests by the families before the school formally remembered the victims. A bronze plaque with their engraved names was quietly and discreetly placed in the entryway over a weekend to avoid too much attention and disruption. Even more hurtful was the lack of reverence my husband and I experienced when we donated a copy of the children's book that we wrote in Charlotte's memory. We donated the books to the schools of Newtown, and 6 months after the books were delivered, I was informed that Charlotte's book had been put in a closet and never made it to the shelves of Sandy Hook School Library. The staff had decided that the book was too tragedy sensitive. Joel and I were careful when writing this book, always remembering that it was for children. It was a sweet book about Charlotte and our family dog. The book has no reference to the tragedy or the shooting. There was nothing sensitive in its nature. My husband and I gave them the biggest gift we could offer, the stories of our children, but the message was clear. No one wanted to be reminded of what happened, and my daughter's name and her story did just that. To discuss the extent and the lack of reverence would take more time than I have today, but I do know that when a community begins to separate itself from those who died, a landslide is likely to follow. All of my experiences as a grieving parent has led me to seek out other grieving parents. Knowing that my experience has left me feeling misunderstood, dismissed, alone, I imagine that parents with different types of loss likely felt the same way at different times. And so I began to attend retreats. I accepted invitations to meet with other bereaved families and parents. I sat in professional panels sharing my experience. And through these experiences, I have met parents who have suffered different types of losses, sometimes multiple losses, and certainly different experiences. It's been through these meetings that I've learned the most about myself, and it's made me more humble. It's required me to take myself out of my own experience and step away from my judgments of whose loss was worse. I checked my judgments that children that die at a younger or older age than Charlotte was somehow more or less tragic. I realized as much as I hated the attention my loss inspired, many families receive little attention or no acknowledgement for their own loss. And as I gave understanding, I found understanding, along with friendship. My ability to sit with others and hear their stories was something I was good at. I was also interested in research about grief and bereavement, in particular research regarding mass tragedy and the effects on families of loss. I was able to find a lot of research on mass shootings, ranging from guns, mental health of the perpetrator, and even helping a community recover. But what I found little on was research on lost families, their experience, and the support and care that they received. I was dumbfounded, and I felt really angry when I learned this. It reinforced my feelings that those who are hurting the most, those most impacted, are being overlooked. It felt personal. Myself and those like me were being unseen, dismissed, not important, and marked up as a lost cause. Fueled by my anger, Joel and I turned to our foundation and established a new initiative, the Helen Bacon Grief and Bereavement Research Initiative. Since establishing it, the CHB Foundation has funded research on lost families of mass tragedy and explored a partnership considering establishing a crisis team to assist families suffering loss from a mass tragedy. And although I've completed formal training and workshops to better equip myself, much of this approach has been learned through my lived experience. My lived experience has been my biggest teacher and my most valuable credential. My journey to this point has been difficult at its best and excruciating at its worst, and always, always with a broken heart. And although I have a broken heart, that does not mean I'm a lost soul, just as I'm not an inspiration because I'm standing in front of you today. I'm simply a mother whose child has died. And even though we've created a legacy in Charlotte's name, there's no stronger truth than this. Charlotte is in my heart, in my soul, and my thoughts. She is a teacher, a giver, and a guide. She is a participant in every decision I make. The impact of these decisions creates waves of after effects that are unknown. And so Charlotte's influence lives for an eternity. And her legacy is truly her own. Thank you for listening today.
Oh boy, that's a hard one, two hard presentations to follow. So let me see here. On 9/11, our son Brad, the oldest of our three children, was working on the 89th floor of the South Tower at the World Trade Center in New York City. When the plane hit the North Tower at 9 a.m., he called my husband at work and left me this message at home.
Hey Mom, it's Brad. Just wanted to call and let you know, I'm sure that you heard, or maybe you haven't heard, that a plane crashed into World Trade Center 1. We're fine, we're in World Trade Center 2. I'm obviously alive and well over here, but obviously a pretty scary experience. I saw a guy fall out of probably the 91st story all the way down. So you're welcome to give a call here. I think we'll be here all day. I'm not sure if the firm's going to shut down for the day or what, but give me a call back later. I called Dad to let him know. Love you.
Sadly, that was the last time we heard Brad's voice. And it's sort of a double-edged sword listening to it, because I love hearing his voice. I just don't like hearing the message because I know what the outcome is. On 9/11, I was working as a clinical social worker in an outpatient mental health clinic. And oddly enough, I had an interest in working with communities impacted by traumatic events. I had heard Marcia Kimmel, who lost her daughter in the Oklahoma City bombing, speak at a conference I attended in the late 90s. And because of this, and this was when you had to go to a library to do research, I did my graduate school at Columbia, so I used to trek into New York and do research on both Oklahoma City and other events and what the response was like. So when 9/11 happened, I had a real unique background. I was a mother of a victim, I was a social worker, and I had an interest in working with communities impacted by other tragedies. After several weeks, families accepted the inevitable, that their loved ones had died in the attacks and they weren't returning home. Because of the destruction at the World Trade Center site, it was a complicated and long recovery effort, so families did not have human remains of their loved ones. This led to the absence of customary religious and burial rituals immediately after a death. So for instance, if you were Jewish and you were not able, as customary, to bury your loved one before sundown, these families had to compensate for not having human remains and having a gap between the time of the attack and coming to the realization that they were going to be commemorating their life in a different way. So to have some sense of normalcy, many families had wakes, they sat Shiva, and some used, as we did, an empty casket at a funeral to symbolically represent that Brad had died. But the other thing is, I didn't want to share with my family and friends the reality that we did not have his remains. In the aftermath of any tragedy, there are spontaneous responses, and New York City was filled with missing person posters almost at every street corner, and vigils. There were banners and candles. So many of you in the audience may have memories of that. A turning point for me was really going to the Family Assistance Center. There had been one set up in New York City, in New Jersey, in Washington, D.C., and then in California, where some of the planes were traveling to. And there are pockets of people at these various locations. But when I walked into the Family Assistance Center and saw the thousands of people traveling in from around the country and around the world, there were families lived around the country, but also 90 countries lost citizens that day. And so there were a lot of language barriers and cultural issues, and families having to travel long distances. And I realized it was almost like a printing press in the Family Assistance Center. Information was coming in rapidly, resources were coming in rapidly, and so many of for instance, the medical examiner, the property clerk, there were Salvation Army, Red Cross, all kinds of agencies there to provide support. And living in Connecticut, there was a very slow response to working with the families. And all the decisions were being made here in New York City. So I contacted our congressman and got the list of Connecticut families, because I realized so many of these women who had lost their husbands, the last thing they could do is leave their small children at home to travel into New York to get information about resources. And so this is where I met Beverly Eckert. Beverly lost her husband, Sean Rooney, and lived in an adjoining community. And so she and I began traveling into New York City and meeting with elected officials and participating in a lot of the processes that I'll talk to you about later. One of the biggest challenges were the numbers of hundreds of organizations that were providing some services. A lot of them had acronyms that I was not familiar with. I knew what the FBI was, but I didn't know what they did related to a crime. I wasn't familiar with Office for Victims of Crime, OVC, DOD, and all the other organizations that were providing some type of service. So when you're going through a grieving process and everyone's doing something, all of these organizations were providing some kind of resource, but it wasn't a holistic approach. Some of the processes families had to go through: filing for missing person reports. They had to provide DNA samples and process death certificates. They had legal documents to complete. There was a victims' compensation fund, which was one of the most horrific processes to go through in documenting the precious life that you lost, and having to provide stories and photographs and so forth on who they were and what role they played in your family. There were victim witness statements and the investigation and the trial, and then accessing social services support. So after these events, federal funding comes to communities, but it's there for about 18 months, and then it goes poof. And many of the families are not even looking for resources until a point where they're already gone. And then, of course, for the people that were injured, the medical treatment that was required. Some of the challenges that we had navigating complicated processes at a time that we were grieving, planning funeral services and attending the hundreds of commemorative events that were going on both in our communities and in the tri-state area and nationally and internationally. Responding to media requests, coordination of organizations and government agencies. How did we navigate all that? And then I mentioned also about the cultural differences and language barriers. When you think about here in New York City, there were everything from illegal immigrants to CEOs of companies and everything in between. And a lot of these, like the FDNY and the NYPD, had their own network, but so many of us didn't. And then the complications of people living around the country and around the world. How are they going to access information? The internet was not what it is today. It wasn't a resource for these families. I also became involved in many of the advocacy issues. And I think, like my experience at the Family Assistance Center, it was really motivated by what I saw as the challenges that families faced. So the notification of remains, we worked with a medical examiner to streamline the process and have a standardized process where families were being notified. Frank and I have been notified 5 or 6 times, most recently just a month ago. And but my first notification was a young 21-year-old policeman who had no training in the notification process. And so I found myself comforting him at my doorstep in November of 2001. And I mentioned about the Victims' Compensation Fund. Commemoration was so important. And I think as you go through the list, long-term mental health care, which was something I never considered in those early days, but it is important, and I know that today. I mentioned earlier that still today, 1,100 families have never received remains. And so now that the DNA process is become more sophisticated. They're expecting to make more notifications 17 years later. So for those families, there's great hope, but also with those notifications comes great grief, because it does open up that loss that you suffered, and you're reliving having to make arrangements, and how do you plan a burial? Do you tell your friends and family? Do you do it privately? All those decisions that families have to face. Advocating for reforms, I was invited to speak at a rally in Washington, D.C. There were a small group of family members that wanted to become involved in pushing for the creation of a 9/11 commission. And I remember, I'd never written a speech before. I avoided speaking publicly, if you can imagine that. And there I was, in Washington. I think it was 98 degrees or something across from the Capitol building. But I think the reason I stuck with that is I remember going from office to office. And as was said earlier, I did not want this to happen to another family member, and these families that were involved did not want this to happen to another mother, father, wife, or child. And so we were traveling from office to office, and I remember meeting with a congressman from Georgia, and he said, "Well, ma'am, I'd really like to help you, but you're not from Georgia. You're not my constituents. And besides, 9/11, that was a New York thing." And I thought, whoa, and that motivated me. Got my blood boiling, but it also motivated me. And so that was much like quicksand. But we did come to, work very closely as the commission was being established with Governor Kane, Lee Hamilton, and the other commissioners. And then I thought after the commission was established and the report was released, that was our thank you very much. It was nice knowing all of you. We're out of here. But it was still several years of pushing for the legislation to be, for it to be legislated, and then the following year for it to be funded and implemented. Commemoration was really important too, and so many of our families became very involved really before there was an infrastructure to create the 9/11 memorial. And so we wanted water, we wanted to be able to touch the names, we wanted the slurry wall that held back the Hudson River to be incorporated. We wanted the footprints of the building, and we wanted most of us, I'd say, wanted the unidentified remains to be in a safe place within the memorial. I also found that I wanted, it was a long period of time before the memorial was built, and we had collected a lot of photographs and a lot of information because we were at that point sending out a weekly newsletter to the families. And what I found was the families, I'd say the fifth year were really, so many of them were just stuck because there wasn't a memorial to go to. They didn't necessarily have a private place where they could go and pay respects to their loved one. And so we started the Living Memorial Project, and our staff became archivists. But they incorporated social work processes, and that we went to hundreds of communities here in the tri-state area, Florida, Washington, D.C., and other places, to meet with the families. And I knew as a family member, there was no way I could go through the hundreds of photographs that I had of my son. I really would need somebody to support me in that process. And I knew I wouldn't want to give the photographs over either. So we came up with a process where they dragged scanners and computers, and they met privately with the families multiple times often and scanned those photographs and created a digital archive. So by the time the memorial was built, we had collected over 85,000 photographs, which we were able to share digital images. So when you go to the In Memoriam exhibit, most of those photographs came from us. One other challenge I wanted to mention, and JoAnn talked about it, you know, it's almost like you're owned by, when it's a public loss, you're owned by people, and you lose your anonymity. But I think the constant references to 9/11 were really challenging. And I saw a turning point for our children when they didn't necessarily have access to graphic photographs and graphic information or details about what was happening. And I remember this, the first issue was really this 102 minutes, which really documented what was happening in the building. And the author chose to take my son's message and incorporate it into the book. And he just happened to be on our distribution list, and I always forewarned families when I knew things were being released or there was something that they should be thinking about. And so I mentioned that in my newsletter that week, and like a minute later, the author called me and said, "What did you mean by that?" You know, but you know, I just thought, you know, we didn't know what it was like to be victims' family members before these events, and so and I just was horrified by that. So after the fact, we actually copywrote Brad's message, but also you know, took legal action, which really went nowhere, but it was really about making a statement and making people aware, either authors and filmmakers that are in this position, that they're incorporating victims' photographs and messages in their films and books, but also to make victims' families members aware that this is something that you have to be cautious of, and the people that are providing services, you know, how can we work together and advocate for changes there? Healing's a journey, and so there were many triggers, and I have to say probably one of the biggest triggers is these subsequent murders going on, and to see other family members in grief, and to be challenged by realizing the journey that they have ahead. And, you know, how can we, you know, as JoAnn talked about, how can we reach out to other family members and help them? But in the case of 9/11, there are other issues, single parenthood, a lot of relationship issues. Sometimes, you know, the wife may have had severed the relationship with the in-laws, and so then the parents not only lost their son, but they also lost access to their grandchildren. Sustaining support, as I mentioned, federal funding's there for 18 months, and then what? Financial issues, medical conditions, subsequent losses. Many of these families, I know some families that lost a son on 9/11 and lost another son and a husband, you know, in the years following. Mental health conditions, and it's very complicated with the PTSD, anxiety and depression, that when you're 17 years later and all of a sudden somebody's presenting with some of those symptoms, how do you sift it out? What is it, and how can we help them? And that's where I see one of the biggest challenges, and there's some people in the room that would agree with me. How can we make appropriate interventions with the children that are struggling, that were young on 9/11 and are now young adults struggling with some of these conditions? And then, as Yael talked about, the intergenerational issues. So for those of you that are in the room that are providing services, think about, after these events, providing accurate, up-to-date information, You know, we want to know what's the status of our loved one and the notification of remains and personal belongings. We need access to social work support. We do not need therapists the day of or probably the month after. It's, you know, at that time, you're just trying to get your family together, you're trying to plan funerals, you're trying to sort it all out, and so we really don't need therapists analyzing, you know, how do you feel? Well, you don't want to really know how we feel after an event like that. Peer networks are very helpful, and I think some of the best groups were facilitated by social workers, so I'm of the belief that peer-to-peer networks are great, but you do have to have a professional that's facilitating that. Including the victims' families and decision makings. I mean, I can't, it would take me all day to go through the list of decisions that were being made that I think family members should have been involved in from the beginning. And then of course the injured, the medical care, financial support and resources. So just in closing, I want to say this was, I think about my life in two chapters, before 9/11 and after 9/11. And so, you know, as Fred and JoAnn talked about, it's a life-changing event to lose someone so suddenly in what could have been a preventable event. But I'm one of, on 9/11, 2,976 other families were impacted. So some of the challenges are certainly holidays, birthdays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Mother's Day, Father's Day. They're always a reminder of the person that's missing in the room. But as we talked about, life does go on, and in our case, our family is growing. Wes, who's now just turned 38, we have, of course, 3 birthdays in the month of September, leading up to the anniversary. Wes is 38, and we now have a granddaughter and grandson aged 6 and 4. Chris is an eligible bachelor here in New York City, so if you have anyone, I'd love to. But Chris was just 13 on 9/11, and Wes was just 20 on 9/11. And oddly enough, they both ended up working in buildings down here in New York City overlooking the memorial. So how do you manage that? Despite Brad's death, you know, as Fred and JoAnn talked about, the incredible people that I've met along the way, many of them who are in the room here today and will be here tomorrow. So that, I think, is the real fortune, because we were thrust into this world. But so many of you have chosen to work with victims' families and survivors and the responders. And so that's really a gift. And, you know, with the passage of time, it's interesting because there were so many people here after 9/11. 17 years later, not so much. But it's those of us that are really dedicated, that really just feel passionate about the work, that want to make a difference, that want to provide the continuity of care that's needed for victims' families. You know, it's like the cream of the crop. So I want to thank you for coming, and JoAnn really is the one that's responsible for me crying. But I do want to thank both Fred and JoAnn for participating today. And we have a couple minutes for questions. Okay, thank you. 10 minutes for questions. Boy, we really, I am so proud of everyone today for staying on schedule, especially us. So, does anybody have any questions for any of us?
I do.
Oh, John Field.
I just want to say I love you.
Oh, thanks, John. Now, for those of you that don't know John Field, if you're going to be here tomorrow, John, stand up.
I am.
John has led the charge in passing the legislation that's provided medical and mental health treatment and really establishing the World Trade Center and the treatment for the responders and survivors. And he has worked tirelessly. And beyond that, he's lost 2,000 friends along the way. So I just want to applaud John for his work and just tell him what an honor it is to know him. So thank you, John. Okay, go ahead, Joe.
Yes, first, my sympathies to the three of you. What would you say is the best thing for us to do? What strategy to do something about the culture in our country of gun violence and violence in our country? And what do we need to do? And how can we help?
Well, this November vote, I mean, that's the number one thing you do. We have a culture in this country that is built into the legislative process, unfortunately. We've allowed folks to be elected who don't want to do anything about it, who have made it about a false premise. I just want to be really clear. My daughter was murdered with an AR-15, and I don't stand here calling for a ban. I don't stand here calling for anybody to lose their rights. This is not a Second Amendment issue, and when people say that, it is the biggest, most awful, delusional lie I can think of. What we ask for is common sense to ensure guns stay out of the hands of people who intend harm. And it's predictable, okay? In the case of my daughter's murderer, all the warning signs were there. Everyone knew, and the law could not stop him from buying weapons. And when the threats were reported, the law did not give law enforcement the ability to go and remove those weapons. What I would say is push back against that lie, but make people vote like your life depends on it, because it might. Do you want to add anything to that?
I wanted to add something like that to that, and I do think before 9/11, I knew nothing, when I say nothing, about politics, and I certainly knew nothing about intelligence reform, but I learned, as you all are learning, about gun reform. And I had friends and individuals that would tap me on the arm and say, "Good luck with your little project." And I thought, you know, my son is dead, and he's never going to come back. But what I'm doing now is for my children and your children, so that the country is safer. And that is true with gun reform, too. And so I think we have to all be active citizens. Mm-hmm. And we have to know our congressional offices. We have to, if there's a campaign going on or a march going on, you need to participate on some level. And it shouldn't fall on as it does, on the shoulders of the victims' families. And that's, I think, we certainly bring a face to the issue, but I can tell you it's exhausting when you want to be home with your family, to be on the train or on the plane or traveling, to talk to people that are not listening. And so I think to have active citizens involved in writing your congressman and calling and asking them about the issues, and to be participating and supporting the people that can represent the issue.
It's not just your congressman, though, it's every congressman.
Absolutely.
I think you got to remove all the myths that you can't go to Congress and fight for an issue of the cause. Most people think that they won't be listened to. Trust me, congressmen and women are paranoid by nature. If you get in their face, they cave. You just got to do it the right way.
Yeah, and give them luncheons. You remember our luncheons for the give them luncheons and make those luncheons bipartisan and bicameral.
But John, you're right. Show up. Go there, call them, write them. And listen, I can tell you when I do that, they respond. And similar to the response you get, people say, oh, well, that's just because of what happened to you. Well, you know what? No, it's not. And if they diss you and don't want to respond to you, you make them respond to you. That is their job, or you organize an effort to make sure they don't get elected again. But we do have the power through our vote, and we need to use it this election.
The other thing to take into consideration is you don't have to go to Washington to do it. They do have local offices that you can visit, and they also have phones and emails. So
Yep.
Their local offices are the most vulnerable. They hide in D.C., so you can't get to them. But if you show up at their local office, trust me, they're game.
Melissa?
I want to know, just as this conversation is going on, is it JoAnn or Joanna?
JoAnn.
JoAnn, I want to know what your reaction is, because this sounds like, I mean, from what you said, part of your struggle was your response was so different. And I'm just thinking about you as I'm hearing this. And you don't have to speak, but, you know.
My response has been different because for my family and I, our privacy was really important. So we have just made it a policy not to talk publicly about our feelings. And we certainly have our opinions on the matter. We just have chosen to do that privately.
You know, and you and I spoke about this because the response of my wife and I is different. My wife falls into this bucket. She is doing everything she can to maintain a level of privacy for her and my son. And I'm off doing what I do because honestly, for me, it's just what felt natural from the very start, and it's just what I feel I need to do. But the thing is, when these things happen, number one, we can't plan for them. They're unpredictable, and nobody ever knows how they're going to respond until it happens. My house is two very different responses, and my wife is just like this in terms of her response. So, yeah.
There's no wrong or right way. It's just different.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kathy?
I just wanted to attest to Mary's hard work over all these years. And the wheels of justice and legislation take a very, very long time. I'm a retired school administrator, and my recommendation, and maybe you don't agree with this, would be you have the power quickly to go to your local school boards and demand some increased safety procedures for your schools.
And I'll just say this, that I can speak to Parkland, but I kind of know a little bit about your community as well. It happened after Sandy Hook. It's happening after Parkland. We are doing it. The effort on school safety has been tremendous. The problem is to just deal with school safety and not address the issue of guns doesn't solve everything.
I understand. I'm just saying for quickness, more rapidness than going to Congress.
My nightmare scenario is if the school was locked down, because my kids always walked out together as a crowd when all the kids were walking out into the parking lot. And my nightmare scenario is that the shooter was in the parking lot shooting at that crowd as they were walking through and shot both my kids. So we've got to harden and secure schools, but we need to deal with the issue of guns in our public arena. But we need to do both. It's not either or, it's both.
I think the time is up, so I just want to thank again JoAnn and Fred for participating, and we're going to have a very quick break. I understand there's brownies in the back of the room, and coffee, which you may need at this point of the day. So just grab something quick, and we'll start the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you.